Welcome. I'm very excited about this particular masterclass. It's the third in our series, but in this one, we're going to talk about human rights protections and the impact of technology. This is the kind of conversation that can go in all different directions. And what I'm excited about is just the breadth of the panel that we have, different viewpoints from an academic side, from the Human Rights Commissioner side, from a practitioners, from somebody at Deloitte, and our own Mafanwe work. So I will introduce the panel in a second. And I'm very excited about the conversation that's going to go on for the next hour. First, though, I'd like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, of elders past and present on which this meeting takes place. And because it's a virtual meeting, I'd just like to highlight that for me, it's in the Camaragal land, which is in the area north of Sydney, but also I'd like to extend that to the land on which and wherever you currently stand. So our speakers today. Sorry, before I jump in, today is also the International Day of Tolerance. So it's going to be a good day to tolerate diverging views. So for our speakers today, first off, I'd like to introduce Ed Santo. Ed has been the Human Rights Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission since August 2016. So he's been doing it for a fairly long period of time. And he leads the Commission's work on technology and human rights, refugees and migration, human rights issues affecting LGBTI people, counterterrorism and national security, and a bunch of other things. Ed wrote a brilliant paper that I read just the other day in 2018, and I'm very excited to see your insights, Ed, and see where we go with them.
Thank you,
Our
Barry.
second panelist is Lyria Bennett Moses. Lyria is the director of Allen's Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation, and is a professor at the Faculty of Law at UNSW. She's also got a very long, really well written out introduction, but I think it's too much, and she said it's too much. But please jump onto Google and see Lyria's very, very impressive CV. Welcome, Lyria.
Thank you.
Our third panelist is Justine Utua. Justine is a manager in the Deloitte Australia's human rights practice. And Justine has also been a legal professional and has turned consultant and has extensive experience across industries and geographies. So she'll bring an international view as well. Welcome, Justine. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
And our fourth panelist is Mafanwe Warwork. Mafanwe is the executive director here at LexisNexis for Regulatory Compliance Global. And she's also, and I think more importantly for the context of the next hour, the executive sponsor for the rule of law in Australia. And Mafanwe is heavily involved in our rule of law program, which extends across the Pacific, and how we can, as LexisNexis, support the rule of law. So before we jump into the questions, I think it'd be good to ask you, the audience, a poll question, which can sort of shape some of the conversation that goes from there. So the poll question is, and if I can ask the technical support to throw this up, how concerned are you about the negative impacts of AI on human rights? Now you will note that we're talking AI specifically here, and where the conversation's broader, it's about technology. We're going to start with technology, but as you no doubt can guess, a fair portion of the conversation will also be on AI. So if you're very concerned, a 1 all the way down to not concerned at all, a 5. So how concerned are you about the negative impacts of AI on human rights? Excellent, and we'll have a look at some of those answers in a second. Now, if we can pull that down, I will start the conversation. The first question is to you, Lyria. So I see the law as often a way in which we, as a society, are able to challenge and accommodate change in our societies, because technology impacts the society in lots of different ways and impacts different people in different ways. And the law is often that sort of buffer, that zone in which that challenge and that accommodation of society to change can occur, and law can actually help us with that accommodation. So I know you've done a lot of extensive research in this space. Could you maybe provide us with a bit of a broad landscape around technologies that have emerged and the challenges that they have posed to the law? And how do we evaluate new technologies in a legal context?
Right. So the reason I suppose it's such a big issue with new technology and law is that if you think about it, and this is, Greg, sort of similar to what you were saying, law is sort of, what we're promoting, what we're encouraging, what we're prohibiting, what we're regulating in particular ways. all the different kinds of activities that people might engage in, right? And we don't regulate everything. There's a lot of room for freedom, but we do make very conscious decisions around all of those kinds of things. What technologies ultimately do is they make new things possible. So it becomes possible to do something that maybe it wasn't possible to do before. And this is a really old problem, right? So we think about this as a very current problem, but it's actually a very old problem. You can go back to examples about balloon flight and whether that would be trespass, right? So you can, there's always this challenge. Once new things become possible, how does that fit with all of the rules that we already have, or what new rules we might need? So there's various things that are sort of in the news at the moment, and I know we're going to come to in this conversation. So one is, if you like, the automation of government decision-making, things like robo-debt, where the logic of the system might differ from the legal rules that were in fact to be implemented, where the scale is much faster than human decision-making. So what laws do we want around that? Do the old appeal mechanisms work, given the scale at which these decisions are made? How is responsibility allocated, particularly where the design of technology is outsourced? So there's sort of one set of problems around there. Another one is all the tools we're getting now for data-driven inferencing. So, risk assessment type tools that purport to say this person's higher risk than that person. And, who's likely to reoffend, who's likely to pay their taxes on time, any other thing we might want to measure. But then the legal questions come up, well, when is it okay to use that? In the US, they're using these kinds of tools for bail, sentencing and parole. Is that kind of context the sort of context in which we want to use ultimately data-driven inferencing type of tools? So again, questions there. You've got things like facial recognition tools, so the ability to identify people and track their movements in space based on cameras that can say, link people that are on those cameras to particular identities. You have law enforcement agencies, for example, with Clearview AI, and there was a lot of controversy around that, using those tools for various purposes. What should be the legal bounds of that? Is it okay to use to identify a criminal if you've got a photo of the criminal? Is it okay to use to identify who's at a protest? Is it okay to use to track all citizens wherever they go? Do pattern recognition for suspicious movements and question them about why they went, halfway to the shops and then back again before going back, if that's deemed suspicious. So in other words, how far do we want to go? What should be prohibited and permitted, particularly when agencies are using those kinds of tools? Now, there's some of the ones in the news recently. Tracking people on phones obviously goes beyond just the facial recognition question, but no such list is ever going to be complete. These problems are as old as railroads, barbed wire fences, hot air ballooning. These questions are sort of ongoing. So other areas where the law has been said to fall behind or be insufficient or not provide enough protections, things like nanomaterials production and chemical regulation. Things like genetic information and duties to warn, things like assisted reproduction and parental rights, right? All of these kinds of areas in the past have been deeply controversial, generating whole legal literatures around what should the law be and how should it operate in this, at the time, new technological context. We can also start to imagine the future. Right, so you've got technologies that allow human brains to be hooked up to machines, a sort of Neuralink example. Yes. Not yet in production for anyone keen to try it, but no doubt giving rise to questions when you have such direct human brain machine interaction. What does that mean for, say, criminal responsibility? So these questions aren't going away. They're old, they're new, they're current, but yes, a whole universe of them.
And the interesting thing is, just on that theme, is the law keeping up? So you talk about, some of the stuff that Elon Musk's talking about, the human-machine brain interface. I mean, is the law keeping up, do you think, or is the law always dragging? And I know this wasn't part of the original question.
Yeah, no, it's good. Happy to answer that one. I think my whole research agenda is focused on answering that question. So if I can't do that, I'm not doing a good job. But look, the answer is it's complicated. So if you think about what law should be should law be written for every conceivable technological development that might happen? My son is learning to drive at the moment. Should he have to learn driving rules for cars like Back to the Future that can overtake vertically? Now, maybe such cars will one day exist, and maybe when they do exist, we will need road rules for them. But we don't necessarily want 16-year-olds having to learn those road rules. Now, priority is they know what to do at a roundabout, right? Yeah. So we don't necessarily want law to get ahead of technology, if that makes sense. Yeah. What we want is law that works well in the current world, right? And possibly, and in an ideal sense, and this is hard, but possibly laws that are well designed so that they can flexibly operate as much as possible as technologies do change. So we want laws, for example, not to use language that ties them to very specific current practices that are going to change very quickly. But at the same time, we don't necessarily want, let's just let our technological imaginary run wild and work out laws for every sci-fi book or movie we can imagine. So I think the idea that law is behind technology is not something that's a criticism, it's almost an inevitability. But we can think about how to minimize the problem as law does constantly answer all the questions that technology puts up.
And that's where you can see sort of the role of futurist, which helps us to understand what is in the near term possible, so that you don't have a flexible law, but it's not too far-fetched or far-reaching.
Or more or less open thinking. So a good example of this is when sperm donation became a thing, and all of the health requirements in all of the US states were built around what the health requirements are for genetic testing and health testing for sperm that had been donated. They did not use the neutral term over, which meant, the neutral term gamete, getting that the wrong way, the neutral term gamete, which meant that when over donation became a possibility, none of the health checks that needed to be done on sperm donors applied. So you can think about when you're creating law, how do we draft this in such a way, not with futurists imagining every conceivable technological possibility, but how do we draft it at least in a way that we're not locking things down that don't need to be?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Awesome, thank you, Lyria. I'm gonna switch tack a little bit, because a lot of what you did bring up there did bring a little bit around AI. You're talking about things like data-driven inferencing, facial recognition, and what it does, and where the limits are. But of course, I think one of the biggest problems in our modern world is that we potentially broadly define AI to be things as simple as what was used to be just a program. And it was cool because I'm a tech guy, so in a while suddenly I became much cooler, because it became, I was doing AI, whereas 5 years ago it was just a program that was being written. So I might switch to you, Justine, and maybe if you can give us a little bit of an idea of what do we mean by AI, and are these terms potentially overused?
Thank you, Greg. At Deloitte, we think about AI as, broadly speaking, being the theory and development of computer systems that are able to perform and even improve the efficiency of tasks that normally would require human intelligence. So, for example, example of tasks would be, visual perception, speech recognition, and decision making and learning under uncertainty. The four key, I think, techniques are of AI techniques are machine learning, speech recognition and natural language processing, deep learning, and visual recognition. But you and I already had a chat about the fact that it is overused a little bit. I had this client who wanted, principles around the use of AI, and we realized when we did a landscape analysis of what they had, that they were not using AI at all. So that was pretty fun to actually have that conversation and tell them, actually, there is no AI being used.
You're not as cutting edge as you think you are. Yeah. And I think the big thing that jumped out for me there was you talked about uncertainty, because that's the thing with AI, really, isn't it? That you're building a system that has to manage in an uncertain world. So it's like a human; it can adjust based on its prior learning to come up with a best guess, if you like. Which potentially is why it becomes quite problematic from a legal system, because how do you therefore explain that? How do you explain the fact that the AI has made the right decision? And I might throw it to you, because I know one of the big things with AI is talking about fairness or bias, and I know you sort of differentiated between those two How do we sort of talk about that issue? And do you mind just taking a little bit of a sec to describe the difference between bias and fairness?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I mean, maybe I need to go one step further back. If you're the subject of a decision, you'll always want a positive decision, in the sense that you always want, if you're applying for a bank loan, you always want the answer to be yes. But what I found when I was a junior lawyer, and what we found in this project and more broadly, when we've consulted the public, done polling and so on, is that people are pretty pragmatic. They understand that not every decision will kind of yield a positive outcome. But what they do want is that the decision be fair. And what does that mean? Whether it's a conventional decision using kind of, very, very old-fashioned human techniques, or something that is more using sophisticated technology. What they want is that the law, the rules to be applied. So if it's that example that I gave of a home loan, if there are a set of criteria, they want those criteria to be fairly applied. They don't want to be otherwise treated unlawfully, and they want any discretion to be fairly applied as well. And I guess what's bound up in all of that is that they don't want to be left at the end of the process with the unsettling feeling that maybe they suffered an injustice, maybe they missed out on the home loan because the applicant was a woman, or because of their race, or whatever it happens to be. But maybe not, and there's no way to find out. So in other words, they want some kind of accountability, some transparency, some reasons, whatever you want to call it. So to return to the kind of nub of your question, when we're talking about bias, it means different things in different contexts. It's perhaps an unhelpful term because it has a very technical meaning, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But when we're talking about it sort of in more colloquial terms, what we're trying to avoid is unfairness. The poster child, the kind of one of the worst forms of unfairness is really if someone, if it's unfairness that is based on what we as human rights practitioners call a protected attribute. So essentially unlawful discrimination based on your race, or your age, or your gender, or whatever it happens to be. But there are other species of unfairness as well. And it's really, when you're talking about unfairness, we're talking about an error that is a really gross error. And that's precisely when it comes to conventional decision making. We've always said for literally centuries that is unacceptable, and we've set up a whole series of kind of mechanisms to identify and correct for that error. And what we need to make sure as we use AI more in decision making, that those mechanisms are, I guess, fit for purpose in doing exactly the same thing. So identifying unfairness and correcting it.
Yeah, absolutely. When we did our catch up last week, it was quite an eye opener for me. Was, I think, Lyria, you said it, that was you, it might have been you, that Apple Mac users potentially pay more because the system picks up that you're an Apple Mac, and Apple Mac users tend to be less price sensitive. I went home because my wife and I have this big thing about Mac versus PC. I'm a PC user, she's a Mac. She was very, very put off by this. And it's just a sort of a local version of unfairness. Obviously, it's a tiny, privileged version of unfairness, but it's just one of those things that resonates quite a bit. Because we've got this up, and I just noticed we had a question come in, and I might throw this to you, Lyria. The question, one of the panelists, one of the participants asked, without being a specialist programmer, how can we actually know that AI codes and algorithms are actually meeting the scope of work? What backdoor bugs have been built in that we don't know about? How can we be certain that trends are accurate? So maybe it's an idea. Maybe I'll throw it to you, Lyria, to talk about on these standards and certifications. And probably part of that is the fairness side as well. So it's one thing to have deliberate backdoor bugs, but then also sometimes they don't work, not because they've been designed not to work, but just that's how they've been trained almost. And so you tend to get unfairness anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing to note there, I think, is that there are a lot of standards, but most of them are still in development. Standards Australia has a committee working with the, the IEC, ISO Joint Technical Committee, sort of standard creation body that's putting together a whole suite of AI standards, which will specify everything from sort of organizational governance of artificial intelligence systems through to sort of specific trustworthy elements, which can be things like fairness, ethics, bias, explainability, and other sort of features. What that will mean is that you can have very clear terminology. So when you're talking about bias or fairness, those terms are defined and you make sure everyone's talking about the same thing, but that also you can devise frameworks at a governance level, at a very high sort of, organizational board type level, but also at a very technical level, what do you need to check? What do you need to measure? What are you looking for particular features to be there? Once the standards are done, and some are done, but a lot is still in development, you can then also create obviously internal processes to check against them, as well as external certification becomes a possibility, and so forth. And that is not just for AI. One of the other things mentioned in that question is the sort of security type things, bugs, flaws, and there are obviously standards that deal with all of that as well. So I think in terms of how do you know? I think the usefulness of standards there is making sure that what questions you're asking are clearly laid out and defined, where relevant mechanisms for doing particular things are specified, processes are specified, tests are specified, and then organisations can take those on board.
I might throw that to you then, Justine. How do you specify a test of AI? Because, and I know machine learning, often what comes in, almost a neural network or a deep learning machine model will learn in a particular way from a particular set, and that potentially can bring in AI bias, etc. Is it easy to test? And I'm not sure where I'm going with this question, but I suppose maybe back to you, Lyria. Just how easy is it to test that a model works? So do you have to?
You can test for particular things. So again, it's about defining the terms you're talking about and then testing for that. So for example, it is very easy to test whether, a particular machine learning process will have a disparate impact when applied to a man or a woman, as an example, right? You can absolutely test that. And you can say, for example, that this test will rate as employable men with, whatever. You can talk about false positives and false negatives. So I mentioned before the example of using risk assessment tools in sentencing and so forth. And one particular tool was tested by ProPublica, which is actually sort of a journalist news organization, who demonstrated that there was a higher false positive rate for African Americans compared to whites. So that is clearly a test that you can run on the data. You can get an answer. This answer didn't look very good, but what you still have to decide is that the right test? Because the organization's response, the company's response to the ProPublica article was to say, we meet a different fairness test, right? We might not meet the equalization of false positive test, but we meet the same risk score has same meaning test. And we think that's the better fairness test. So what standards can do is they can help you measure the different things and define the terminology. What standards can't necessarily do is say, for a particular society, in a particular context, what do we mean by fairness? Because that's, you can test for particular technical things, but ultimately you have to decide, is it unfair that there is a higher false positive rate for a particular racial group? Is that something we want to fix? I would argue yes, but others might argue no. And so they're the real questions that you need to think about, and that ultimately, I think discrimination law needs to think about how it can specify what requirements are in Australian law where these kinds of automated data-driven assessment tools are used.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point for Australian law as well, in terms of also recognising that you don't need intent to discriminate, and that sort of goes into, consciousness and all those kinds of things that you have to deal with when you're thinking about AI. And of course, that Compass software is being gone over in detail, especially from people like us who provide legal information, how it can be used. Because the really interesting thing about it, I thought, was that they didn't have like a factor, a projected attribute. indicating race. Like that just wasn't in the software. It was that other factors were used as proxies for that, and that's how that ended up happening. What was a concern, I suppose, from a human rights aspect was that the company didn't want to release the algorithm, so no one else was able to attest whether it was fair or not. And although we've talked a lot about whether law can keep up with technology, I think the thing you don't want to, that you need from the old legal system is those principles of admin law, like natural justice and procedural fairness. If you don't have that accountability or transparency, then no, you shouldn't be using that software.
If I can just go back to one other point about just verifying the accuracy of an AI-powered tool. Sometimes, there's a very basic test that is never deployed, and I can't quite work out why. So if you take facial recognition as an example, because it's a particularly controversial one. We know from some of the leading research that it tends to be less accurate in respect of people basically who don't look like me. So if you're a white middle-aged man, it's reasonably accurate, probably less accurate than most people you know, but still reasonably accurate. But if you don't fit that description, it becomes wildly inaccurate very quickly. So before deploying it in real life, like, in a policing situation where you're trying to identify criminal suspects, you've got a headshot photo, but you don't know who they are. I guess my question is, why wouldn't you always deploy it in a kind of a setting where you actually do know the answers, but you're depriving the decision-making system of those answers, and you see how accurate it is, because you've got the answer key, as it were. So I'm trying to obviously provide a simplified description of what happens, but it's actually not that complicated to test an AI-powered system in a range of scenarios. It's not always possible, but for a lot of decision making, it actually is, or at least you could get to a level of accuracy, or you could test it to a level of accuracy, which I guess represents the state of the art.
That's done, Ed. So in terms of the way machine learning, like just routine machine learning is done, there will be a training phase and then there will be a testing phase, and that testing phase is based on known data. Is that
I suppose the question.
I realize that it's done, but what I'm saying is that it's not done rigorously enough, and it's not always done effectively, right? So
is that a space for? Sorry, Ed, is that a space for the legal or the human rights community to sort of set up and say, this is the testing data you should use that is fair?
You could. So you can either, I mean, with regulation, you often have a choice. You can either provide a very specific way of achieving a particular result, and I think that's what you're describing. Or you can say, look, you have to have this kind of level of accuracy, something, a broader rule, like, it must be no worse than the state of the art in terms of how you make your decision. But how you achieve that is up to you. Here are a few ways of doing so. I accept that in any kind of, proper system, you have some kind of testing phase, but my criticism is that often that is done too quickly, not rigorously enough, not comprehensively enough, and too often it's done almost in a live situation. So when we talk about kind of beta testing a product in the real world, often we mean that product is being tested at a point where everybody knows, or at least all of the developers know, it's not quite there yet. But the hope is that in that testing process, in a live population, you will identify bugs and be able to squish them on the way. Now that's all very well, but if you are the victim of a bug in the system, then particularly if what the outcome is that you're falsely identified as having committed a crime, then there's all kinds of kind of human rights violations that can't be undone. And that's the dirty secret for human rights lawyers like me, is that the legal system will do as much as it can to kind of restore your dignity if you have been falsely arrested, unlawfully detained, and so on. But what actually can be done to kind of effectively address that problem? There's no perfect remedy.
Justine, how do you advise your clients with these kind of ethical dilemmas?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I also work on the way people make decisions as well, and it's interesting how it's pretty much the same problems. For my clients, it's really about making sure that there is a human being at all of the different stages of the life of technology. And making sure, it's like everything, strong governance, making sure that there is real consequences for failures as well, and really have strong accountability systems in place. And I work with my risk control team, and it's like those massive documents where you identify every single risk that can occur and what exactly needs to happen and who needs to own each of those risks, and how do you report that back. And it's quite it's quite incredible what the risk controls team can actually do, to be honest. But yeah, I think as long as you keep humans in the loop, there will always be, the human error and the human weakness part of it. But it does mean that you learn with the technology as well.
Yeah, human in the loop. Of course, that then slows it down. So imagine some pure techies feel pretty strongly about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's contextual though. I think you have to, you have to look at the whole system, and not, yes, a lot of things human in the loop can help. So a good example of where human in the loop can help is comparing Australia's robo-debt problem with what Sweden did, similar kind of system and similar kind of, it was a student debt repayment type system. And they had, the decision maker, what the system outputted was a draft letter that the decision maker had to sort of look at, sign, adopt, and send off. And that ultimately created a sort of breakpoint for any system outputs, like where 20% of debt letters shouldn't have been sent. You can sort of get the humans picking up, hold on, this isn't working. So absolutely can work in some context, but not necessarily all contexts. So an example might be something like automated vehicles, which we don't really have in a full sense yet. But it's possible that human in the loop plus machine might actually be worse than either alone, right? The override decisions won't be at the right times, they'll be at the wrong times, and so forth. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'd want to do testing. So it's not necessarily the case that human in the loop makes things better. It really is about looking at the system, I think, as a whole and working out, is this something, really thinking through, is this something where having a human in the loop contextually, it's important enough that it matters. You don't need a human in the loop for every Google search result, for example. That would really slow Google down. But also, where it is important and how it's structured. So, making sure those humans have enough understanding of the system that they can and have power to override it.
Yeah,
something on that point.
Sorry.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. It's such an important point that I think Lyria is making, which is, in principle, putting a human in the loop is a good thing, can only be a good thing. But I guess, and correct me if I'm paraphrasing you incorrectly here, Lyria, you need to design the system in a way that the human will be empowered to improve the decision-making process. And so to give a couple of practical examples, we know that for some categories of decision-making or drawing of inferences, humans are really, really poorly placed as compared with, sophisticated machine learning techniques. And so having the human kind of second guessing the machine is more likely perhaps to give rise to the sorts of errors that Lyria is referring to. And then for other categories of decision-making, particularly if we're talking about kind of polycentric decision-making, exercising what we would often see as quintessentially human discretion, on the whole, humans are still kind of outperforming machines. And so, you want to kind of calibrate your kind of overarching decision-making system in a way that it reflects that. And then I guess the other point is a really anthropological problem. So we've been looking a little bit about at the emerging field of algorithmic deference and algorithmic aversion. In other words, where you're sitting in front of your computer, you're the human decision maker. You in theory, have all the power. The computer says, this is what the decision should be. And you're not really well equipped to actually kind of kick the tires and work out whether it's something that is a reliable decision or not. And so you often will have a really extreme reaction. You'll just go, oh, well, the computer said it, so it must be right. It's a computer, right? Or you'll say the opposite. You'll go, I've got no idea, how this silly machine came up with this decision. And so I'm rejecting it. And, those extreme reactions, if they're not kind of rationally based, can be equally dangerous.
I think Ed's just dropped out for a second. Did you guys hear that last bit?
Oh, I think I was getting to the end of my.
That's all good. But it's a very good point. And I think also, and switching this now a little bit to the legal practitioner space, this is good in the general sense, but what happens when it comes to our industry, to the law and the decision making that happens in the law? And Lyria, I think in your introduction, you talked a little about some legal decisions and how automated, and to some extent, robo-debt is almost not a legal decision, right? You decide that you have a debt and you're going through a legal process. So Mafone, I might throw this to you, because I know we do quite a lot as LexisNexis. We do quite a lot about evaluating judgments and outcomes and predicting, maybe not even predicting, but at least analyzing and showing potential biases in legal decisions. Is that a step too far? I mean, where does analytics on legal decisions and the legal process start to become a step too far? Or is there a step?
Yeah, I hope there's not a step too far. Of course, the purpose, obviously, of legal information providers like LexisNexis is actually to take the huge amount of primary materials that come through every year from courts and governments and help legal practitioners understand how to apply that to the matter at hand. And analytics can only, you would hope, assist in doing that, in finding the right case, the right piece of legislation, the latest change, whatever it is. But I think also you'd want to break this down into what, I guess, where we might be somewhere on the continuum between descriptive and diagnostic analytics. So what has happened and why did it happen? And then think about what predictive analytics, what will happen in the future might happen. Although I think the whole prescriptive analytics is a whole other field, and you could probably talk for another hour about whether that's even a good idea in the first place. But in terms of the first categories, the descriptive and diagnostic, I actually think there's huge benefits for rule of law and access to justice in possibly vulnerable groups, or at least self-represented litigants or people who aren't familiar with the legal system, to understand what a likely outcome might be for them, to what the cost of benefit of engaging one kind of dispute resolution method or another for them as individuals, but also maybe for the entire judicial system, that, less cases going to court can only improve access to justice overall. So definitely some positives. And we've already sort of touched on the negatives of things like Compass and being unable to interrogate or audit the algorithm. But I think it's interesting even to think about predictive analytics for a common law system where not only can decisions be overturned, but long-standing and long-accepted legal principles can be overturned by the higher courts. So how can you predict that is going to happen? And I just want to quote my colleague, the executive manager for Core Product, who recently quoted in the Law Society Journal as saying, "There is no auto magic." And I think that's true of legal decision-making as well.
Auto magic. I think you might have just coined a term. So a question from the audience, would a TGA style certification process for AI products be a solution to this problem? I think in the smaller sense, like a Google search answers, but is there a threshold at which you do need some sort of almost certification process?
I think there'd be two challenges in that, and I'll pass to others and their views as well. But I think the big challenge would be, what is AI? And we had a definition earlier from Justine. There are so many different definitions out there that really, I always find people either want to be within or don't want to be within. So, when nanotechnology was defined and the US government said there's going to be all this funding for nanotechnology, suddenly everyone was doing nanotechnology. Most of material science became nanotechnology, right? But if they said we're going to regulate nanotechnology and you have to go to the TGA for your nano product, suddenly no one's doing nanotechnology, right? So in a sense, there's a lot of people now that for marketing reasons call what they're doing AI, but the definition is so loose that it's very hard to know, is it, isn't it, would everyone in the field call it AI or not? So my sense is, if you sort of said, TGA style AI has to, go through an approval process, suddenly We'll go from everyone doing it to no one doing it. I think you need to define, where you might require certification in different ways. A very simple way to do it, I spoke about standards earlier. A very simple way to do it would be to say, just as a first sort of level thing, that when government outsources, its processes and its decision-making processes through its procurement policies, it demands compliance with certain standards. I mean, that would be a way to fix a lot of the problems without the sort of heavy-handedness of, a sort of TGA for AI.
Which almost is beautiful because it opens up the next question from one of the audience members, which is, does any of the initial discussions suggest a different track for government versus the private sector? So is there a different, does government have a different role? And they in particular are thinking about the US Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment as an existing break. But is there a different approach that government takes to the private sector? And maybe it is just that government influences through the way they outsource.
If I can just jump in on this one. I mean, in one sense, before you even get to procurement and outsourcing, there's a more fundamental way in which government is treated differently. And that is that, if the government is making a decision, whether it's making that decision using artificial intelligence or some old-fashioned conventional means, there will almost always be some kind of legal, usually legislative authority for making that decision, which will define the limits of the legal kind of justification for using for making that decision, and it will set some legal requirements for how that decision be made. And so those legal requirements have to be met, however the decision is being made, whether it's being made using AI or otherwise. The challenge, I would say, as AI becomes more pervasive, is that government in particular continues to adhere to those requirements, particularly the kind of overarching ones, the ones that are there to do things that are so fundamental, that are there to protect the rule of law, protect accountability, protect people's basic human rights, that we don't lose sight of that. So the short answer is yes, the government is already subject to, on the whole, more onerous requirements. To give a practical example, there are far more requirements for government to provide reasons for a decision than is the case for non-government decision making. And so that sort of more onerous level is already there, and the challenge is working out kind of novel ways of meeting those requirements.
Okay, I might switch entirely now, because Justine, when you and I caught up, you talked a little bit about switching because this can be quite negative, these conversations, right? You can quickly get into what AI can do and the negative impact of AI. And you had some pretty exciting thing. You talked about how the random government has used technology to bring direct democracy in tech and how it's made it enabled. So maybe if you take a little bit of a second and just sort of lift us up a bit, if you don't mind, and talk about some of the opportunities that you see, not just in AI, but in tech in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So Deloitte worked on this really interesting report with the Global E-Sustainability Initiative, Jesse, last year. And we just looked at how technology can can help us meet the 2030 agenda. And it's just really interesting, on its current trajectory, we're not going to deliver the 2030 agenda. And it was really the opportunity for our generation to move the world onto, a sustainable path. And because digital technology is really interwoven into all that we do, we thought, let's just have a look at, can we tell a good story? Because, technology is neither good or bad, nor is it neutral. It's really about how we develop and deploy technology that matters. So obviously, without dismissing or ignoring the fact that technology can be used for evil, for lack of a better word, right now. I think technology, obviously, like we all know on this panel, can be used to really scale incredible development. So I just wanted to think through, the way we constructed the report was around 4 things that technology helps us do. So it's connect and communicate, So it really opens up relationships, information, ideas, and opportunities. It helps us monitor and track the world around us, so that our impact is, more transparent, and we can make, targeted interventions. The analysis part as well, it helps us analyze vast swaths of information, optimize processes, procedures, and resource productivity, and predict where do we need to intervene. And finally, it can augment our human abilities, help us. I think we invented a word for that report, which was automate. So I'm French, so I wasn't sure if it was a real word, but it still shows as a mistake on my Word document whenever I write it.
I'm pretty sure that's not a normal English word. Yes, automate. Yeah, cool.
I mean, we're consultants, so we had to create a buzzword out of this report, right? But it's really to create, an active bridge between the physical and the digital worlds. That's the last phase. And what we had to look at is that out of the 169 targets, 103 are actually directly influenced by these technologies. And we did a deep analysis of 20 of those targets. And the expected deployment of critical digital technologies across those 20 targets will, on average, help accelerate by 22% our achieving of the SDGs, and importantly, mitigate the downward trends by 23%. So those are quite hard data. It tells a good story, hopefully, if it is deployed in the right way. But I think what's really important for a lot of companies to understand, and procurement officers and users, is that digital technologies, they really need to be designed and developed and deployed with positive social impact in mind. So that's where the human rights, impact assessments is so important, and having, human rights practitioners part of those conversations as well, to help you not just think about yourself, your business, but really think about the people that will be impacted by technologies. And yeah, there was this example that I just wanted to mention. For example, I worked at the UN a few times back, a few years back, and we had this roundtable in New York, and this lady was talking to us about the developments in Rwanda and how technology was used. And I think the portal is called Irembo. And it's a portal that they created, reconstructing the country after the genocide and everything. And it's a government platform where a lot of people could access all of those critical administrative services that they were deprived of for so many years. And, now I think you've got, I can't remember how many services are available, but it was just very empowering for a lot of people that had been, left behind for so many years. And then that's the kind of really, I just remembered the entire room was just transcended by her story, and how technology and, good partnership between government and technology companies really created incredible positive change. And, it might seem like small numbers for Australians, but I think per month they had close to 100,000 users. Yeah. Which is quite interesting when you look at the uptake of ICT technologies in Rwanda. So yeah, I just wanted to mention the opportunities and the good stories.
Yeah, completely. And it is, my long ago career was in mobile tech when mobile first emerged. And one of the things that we were working in India, and we saw that the average fisherman in India's wages went up by about 50% when mobile phones came out, because they could start to SMS and find out the prices in the different markets. And so they could choose which fish market they were going to go offload, which of the small ports they were going to go offload their fish based on that price signal. Whereas before they couldn't. They'd come in blind and they'd end up getting a worse. So they could essentially sell their catch while they were on the boat, and they'd change their earnings by 50%. You're right, technology has obviously it's got a great positive potential. That's amazing what happened in Rwanda. That's quite something. Lyria, just given your background in education, how do you, as an educator, how do you approach this? Because it's a very complicated and wide-ranging topic. How do you actually teach law students, about this interaction between technology, human rights, how to think about it, what's emerging? Well, that's a very broad question.
Yeah, very broad question. So I'm actually going to start before law students, because I'm going to get to law students in a minute. But I think before we get to law students, we should actually think about what we should be doing in high school. Because the problem in high school is students learn all of their data stuff in maths in complete isolation from the real world. So it's all hypotheticals, HSC syllabus. I mean, I'm sure you know the whole game. What we're not doing is getting students to think about the limitations of what they're learning about data alongside historical injustices they might be learning about in history, alongside ethical questions, alongside other things, and thinking holistically about, for example, why might we or why might we not want to use statistical techniques in sentencing people? Right, as a society, as something that everyone should be educated on. One could also say, leaving the AI aside, for example, how do we know? What are the mechanisms in place, technical or otherwise, for the security of elections? What are the limitations of those? I mean, if people learn that as sort of pre-adult citizens, they're going to be asking all the right questions when they are citizens and not ask some of the stupid wrong ones, right? So we can help people have a better understanding, a better interdisciplinary understanding outside what they're learning in all the different subjects, to ask all of the kind of questions we've been asking here, because I think actually every citizen should. This is not just for lawyers. But going into what lawyers should need to know, I like to divide this up a little bit. So the first question is, what should every lawyer know? In other words, what do universities have a responsibility to ensure that everyone finishing a law degree knows, right? And obviously there's a whole bunch of stuff there, Priestley 11 and so forth. I'm not going to go into the whole syllabus question, but there are also questions about technology, right? So for example, the kinds of issues we've been talking about with the automation of decision-making or use of data-driven inferencing by government should absolutely be a topic in administrative law, right? I just don't think, especially post-robo-debt, that anyone should do an administrative law course and not look at the implications of some of the technologies coming through. Similarly, for criminal law, data-driven inferencing, how might that be introduced? Evidence, how might that get in? Is it legitimate evidence to introduce a risk assessment score? All important questions to be covered, whether it's criminal process or evidence or wherever else it might go. In contracts, what is a smart contract? Does the word smart contract mean that it's a contract for contract law necessarily in some cases? I think, again, these are sort of basic literacies that one would expect anyone with a law degree to have. And I think universities are already doing this work and or hopefully are on the way to doing this sort of work, so that, law students have that general orientation into the technology that's relevant. In addition to that, I think we need to create the right kinds of opportunities. And this is part of, I suppose, ensuring that there are people, at least in the next generation, if not already, who can do better than some of the sort of problems we're seeing at the moment. So UNSW now is running a dual degree program in data science and decisions law. This is actually 4 faculties. So you learn mathematics and statistics, you learn computer science and programming, you learn business and business decision making, and you do law. And you get all of those skills, and hopefully people with all of those skills can do a better job of, as we were discussing earlier, the kinds of tools that you can use, that you can create for people who are like, do I litigate? What are the costs likely to be? How much damages might I get? But do it in a way that takes into account the limitations of the data and so forth, and doesn't present maybe a more misleading picture. Or to take up one of the comments in the questions, the challenge of bargaining in the shadow of big data, right? Instead of bargaining in the shadow of the law, are you going to be bargaining in the shadow of big data that in fact has never been litigated, because people are just basing it on other people's decisions, and you get into a really crazy vicious loop. So dual programs, courses that allow for more in-depth analysis of particular issues are great. So I've got a new course starting up next year on regulation for cybersecurity, which is taught with engineering. So that lawyers, again, can not every law student necessarily, but at least there'll be some people who are literate across the sort of legal issues and the technical issues in the context of cyber. Giving law students experience running legal tech projects, and a number of universities are doing this now, where students get into groups and create, legal technology tools and understand what those tools can do and all the good things, but also the limitations, how hard it is, how user testing doesn't always yield usefulness of things you think are going to be useful, and so forth. So experience, in a broader frame. So there's absolutely lots that universities are already doing. Obviously, I have a bigger lens on what UNSW is doing, but I think everywhere, both fixing core courses, but also creating new opportunities.
Yeah, completely. I think a lot of that comes down to critical thinking, right? Just how well are we training our students to be critical thinkers, to use data, to ask the right ethical questions, and to cross-correlate their different skills. One question from the audience that came up was, do you think there should be an ethics in technology class in senior school? So maybe not so much legal, but more in ethics in technology.
Yeah, I think it's like human rights technology. Ethics, of course, can be much more subjective. And I think it's really important. I didn't do a human rights course at law school, but I know one of my colleagues has a master's, for example. And I think understanding that and then understanding the technology, but as Lyria says, trying to put all those things together, and also so that organisations or government bear the burden of ensuring that fair decisions are made rather than the vulnerable groups, I think is really important as well.
Excellent. Just going to go look through. I've got 5 minutes left in the chat. It's been a very good chat. I've really enjoyed this. I might just, there's 3 open questions. I might throw these quickly to, first off, the one to you, Justine. When you first talked about AI, you gave 4 different machine learning, visual. Do you mind just redoing those 4?
It was machine learning, deep learning, speech recognition, and natural language processing, and visual recognition. But they're just key activities.
Key activities, absolutely.
Key techniques. Sorry.
I know something we're doing here is a lot of natural language understanding. How do you actually understand the meaning of a case, and what are the key facts and legal issues that it hinges on, and can you learn that? Can a machine learning do that?
Yeah, but as Lyria was saying, there's a lot of definitions out there. This is just the one Deloitte has adopted since last year.
And those are pretty much the cutting edge of where it's at the moment, right? It might change in a year or 2. Yep. Second question was, with less cases going to court, and this is an interesting one. It comes down to the big data problem, is when the big data becomes small, does that then make the unfairness or the bias start to get even more pronounced? So with less cases going to court, does that start to give you this closed loop feedback where the legal principles are actually applied with less transparency because you've got decision making on less cases and therefore potentially more variability?
Yes, and this was my point about bargaining in the shadow of big data, right? It changes things. So if, for example, to take family law as an example, right? If, say, at a particular point in history, women are prepared to settle for less or whatever, for whatever reason, that gets embedded into the data. That then becomes the basis of all the forecasts of what the split's going to be. That becomes the basis for decision making, and that loop can actually get worse. AI can often amplify trends, and so the loop can actually get worse over time. And if the cases are not going to court, so that's not intervening, you've got a potential feedback loop problem. The real question, though, coming back to what I was saying about systems and thinking through this in a comprehensive way, is what is the relevant data set to train on? So yeah, you're better off training on court decision data, which has its own problems because, of course, only a minority of cases go all the way through to judgment, and they're skewed in particular ways, or settlement data, which is going to be skewed in very different ways. There's no necessary right answers here. I think it's about making that selection in the particular context very carefully, but also putting up enough flags around it in terms of how it's used to make it clear what the limitations of it are. That, especially as I was saying about education before, but not everyone understands that when a tool says this is what you're likely to get, that has all sorts of assumptions built into the modeling that gave you that number.
We have 2 minutes and 2 fascinating questions. So I'm going to throw to one and let's see if we can get to the last one, which is a fantasy question. So hopefully we've got the time. So the first one, and maybe I'll throw this to you, Ed. If you were teaching public servants, what is the one concept you would want them to take on board re AI?
I think it may have been a point that Mufanwe or Lyria made. It's that the AI isn't magic. that it's a technique. It's still in its relative infancy, and it can actually yield some fantastic results. It can help us do things that we weren't able to do as well before, but we can't sort of cede our good judgment and our independent judgment to the machine. We need to be really rigorous in assessing how accurate and effective it is.
In fact, that's a great way to answer for any tech question. Tech is not magic. Approach it as if you don't think somebody, because they can program whatever, is somehow better than you or knows more than you. They don't. They're just making it up just as much as we all are. And the final one, and I've got a minute left, but how would we view an AI becoming sentient? So this is a whole general purpose thing. I might throw this to you, Justine, and give you 1 minute if you can. How would you view an AI eventually becoming sentient, and how much would it be able to argue? Actually, this is quite a complicated question to answer in a minute. What I might do is...
You would want a human rights for a sentient AI, so to introduce a whole level of complexity if the AI had sentient.
Especially
with an expand my job.
You might want to think also about the right time to answer that question. I said before, we don't yet want road rules for cars that overtake vertically. I think the sort of idea of sentient AI, before we even know what that might mean, it might be too early to answer.
Although disappointing that we do not have hoverboards or cars that can vertically overtake Lyria, just saying.
That is a very, actually, Lyria, I've also got a daughter doing learners, and I'm petrified of her being able to overtake vertically. That's Thank you all for an awesome panel. It's been great to have you on. We will be posting some of this online in different quotes and pulling it all together. But this has been a great conversation. Thanks to the participants for coming on. And the next masterclass will be next year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.